The DQ and US Bank here with you today. We are here to talk about creating sustainable mobile accessibility programs. My name is Chris McMeeking. I'm the mobile accessibility lead at Deque Systems. With me, I have Derrin Evers, accessibility team lead at US Bank, and Julian Kittelson-Aldred, mobile accessibility expert at US Bank. Derrin, go ahead. Goals for this presentation. We are all passionate about mobile accessibility, and we want to share that knowledge with you. Starting last summer, I didn't actually even know Julian and Derrin at the time, and not only did they share a passion about mobile accessibility, become great friends throughout a partnership that we formed, and that partnership was key in the success of this story. And finally, we want to help you understand the importance of dedicated native accessibility expertise within your organization by looking at a process that has worked for US Bank that we think we can be replicated across other organizations. There. So one of the things that we want to do with this presentation is treat it more like a discussion. We don't want to present at you too much. We have some stories that we want to share, and within those stories are things that, lessons that can be learned, takeaways, and maybe things that you'll hear that are occurring at your organization. And but most of this is an experience between the three of us that we want to share with you. And we invite your questions, especially at the end. We hope to have time left to discuss and talk at the end about maybe you see some of the things that we're talking about happening at your organization, or some of the solutions are interesting to you, and hopefully we can have that open discussion part at the end. And please feel free to ask questions throughout. There's the Q&A panel, but we will probably save those for the end and discuss them. Derrin? All right, so one thing I do want to make clear is what do we mean by mobile accessibility? Mobile accessibility is huge. You could be talking about mobile web accessibility, which in itself is somewhat separate from web accessibility. You could be talking about React Native accessibility, hybrid application accessibility. So let's define what we mean by mobile accessibility in this context, because it's important. And basically, this includes applications written in Android Studio, in Java or Kotlin would be the languages involved. In Xcode, Swift or Objective-C, iOS applications. React Native, and many other hybrid frameworks, but really primarily React Native. And the reason that we're talking so specifically about this is when you think about the web and the way the web works. Websites are structured languages. There's standards and organizations that create web standards. And there's a unique thing that happens when you develop a native application, iOS or Android application, and it applies to React Native as well. And that thing is that you are somewhat at the whim of the platform manufacturer and the capabilities that they supply in order to make your things accessible. And that limiting factor also gives you more power. That direct access to that APIs gives you more power. However, there's also a lack of standards and a lack of information out there. And so native mobile accessibility presents unique challenges because of those things. And so that is what we are here specifically today to discuss. Derrin? So what are those challenges? I hinted at them a little bit. But let's dive in detail and make sure we hit all of the bullet points that we're going to cover in the presentation. Native mobile is different. One of the things that companies fail to acknowledge is that native mobile is different in a lot of ways. Not only in the fact, like I said, the standards and all of that stuff, but the behaviors of Android apps differ from mobile websites. A button on an Android application should not necessarily behave like a button on a website. And you could come up with tons of examples of that. Behaviors of iOS apps differ from Android apps. If one of the common things that I hear when I run into an initial native mobile accessibility consulting engagement is, should my iOS app behave like my Android app? And the answer is no, it shouldn't. But how should it be? Another super important bullet point is attempting to subvert these behaviors, attempting to make your iOS app behave like your Android app, or vice versa, is the default tendency of most accessibility experts who come from a web accessibility background. But this is actually making things not accessible. You're subverting users' expectations when you do this. And so finally, my final point on challenges for native mobile accessibility is achieving this all in a sustainable way is very difficult. There's not much information out there. The information that is out there is very frequently shared by accessibility experts that are not mobile accessibility experts, that are not native accessibility experts. And so you go out there, you find this information that encourages that belief you have in your knowledge, or that belief that is being shared by other individuals, and it's just not accurate. And so achieving this in a sustainable way becomes difficult because of all of the misleading information out there, and it's a very, very difficult ecosystem to navigate. Derrin, go ahead. And so this brings me to a point where I'm going to hand it off to Derrin. He's going to kind of quarterback us through here. This is a system that US Bank has come up with, that we work together to figure out. And Derrin at that point knows way more about what's going on with US Bank. And also he's going to quarterback us through the conversation, the process that we use to get here. Derrin, go ahead.
Right. Thanks, Chris. So the thing that we wanted to really kick everything off as far as us building on this kind of story idea is let's peek at the last page. So here is really where our strategy kind of led us to, or what our history kind of led us to from a strategy standpoint. And I'm going to break down this graphic a little bit, and I'll break down each of the graphics as we go through them. So let's just start kind of in the upper left-hand corner here where it says product teams, the icon in blue. So, a product team, from what we're talking about, is essentially an agile team. And the product team is meant to, plan, design, build, and test our products or features in some sort of agile format. If we start looking and going around this graphic clockwise, you can see the next thing we see here is the accessibility design consultants. And this team really is the core of what myself and Julian do. This is kind of what our team represents. And we are here to support the UX contributors within the product team. And we do that by partnering with them to kind of help them make design decisions, help them review wireframes and designs and content and stuff like that. If we keep going around, we see the other icon in red, the accessibility development consultants. So they are kind of like our partners in crime. They assist and consult with the development contributors within the product team, doing so by helping with researching technical accessibility problems and helping document solutions, as well as review and assist in kind of testing methods and strategies around that. At the center of all this, we have what I kind of call the common source of truth. And this is, these are resources and tools that are available to everybody within the product team, and it allows us to define things like design standards and patterns. They outline development tools and frameworks we might use, testing methods and strategies, training and knowledge strategies, those types of things. Finally, the dotted lines kind of on the outside is this kind of back pocket, third-party consulting and services that we may utilize, we may leverage. And those would be something along the lines of performing audits or conformance statements, and also helping us with like strategic development assistance. So that's kind of where we landed. So what I want to spend the next few slides on and have this discussion with Julian and Chris is talking about the story that kind of got us there. I muted myself for a second. So here is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about 1 year, and I'm going to try and do that in 20 minutes so we have plenty of time for questions. This is, how what we're going to show is kind of like how our story unfolds over this year. I'm not going to get into details about, specific timings of things necessarily, but I will highlight kind of when we are and how long things kind of take. We're going to talk about some of the twists and turns, but we're going to keep things fairly high level. And, we're going to also look at and set the stage for, understanding, the steps that led us to such a strategy as I showed. Before I jump into that, I want to touch on one thing real quick, and that is kind of like what our UX accessibility team kind of makeup is, because that's where our story really kind of starts. So our UX accessibility team is a team of 8 consultants. We support nearly 50 product teams. And we also support our own kind of growing practice that we're developing within US Bank. Our main role, as I stated earlier, is to support the UX contributors. And we do that, like I said, by reviewing design artifacts, making sure that we're not creating inaccessible designs or walking down paths that will lead to inaccessible products later on. We annotate those designs to make sure that there's requirements and expectations attached to them, so that as our designs and plans make it through the product lifecycle, the information that we want to keep with it makes it all the way to our developers and so on. And we also empower our designers through support, through demos, through all sorts of things to make sure that everybody is to a certain level and has everything they need. So let's go back a year. About a year ago, the accessibility support structure for our mobile product teams looked like this. We had our mobile product team, and then we had some accessibility consultation. The support from the accessibility consultant side was from 2 consultants, one of which is Julian here with us today. The UX accessibility team it was very interesting dynamic. We had limited visibility or authority into what was actually being developed. We were really kind of left to support the UX, contributors only, and we're essentially told that development was confident that they aren't going to be introducing any accessibility defects due to implementation and things like that. We were able to access the application through occasional pilot releases, and we got better at the process of like getting, more, builds as time went out. But at this time, we were really getting kind of pilots and could really only see things periodically as far as like getting your hands on the app. So while we were able to keep our designs honest, there were a lot of unknowns under the hood. But we were kind of told, we're good. So as we got closer to, kind of the launch date for our app, we had previously set aside some funding to bring in a third party to basically do acceptance testing. What we wanted to do is bring in someone, unbiased to review what was built and make sure that the business line was receiving the thing that they had asked for. We brought DQ in to do this. They carried out the testing. We set up and allowed the teams to provide us with a sampling of the screens that they owned, and we gave them over to DQ to test. Over the period of about a month it took, we ended up testing almost 200 screens. I don't think it was quite, but almost. And what was discovered was essentially hundreds of defects. The product teams were shocked. They did not expect this. They certainly didn't feel like they had the resources to deal with it. It was kind of blew their mind a bit. It was very interesting. This is where I want to turn and ask Chris a question here, because he was being kind of the DQ rep. There's something here that I'm interested in. I'm sure a lot of people that we have in our audience are asking themselves as well. And so my question to Chris is, DQ is obviously used to audit products like this all the time. You guys, this is a service you provide. How common is it for you to see, 100 defects that kind of seemingly come out of left field, kind of at the end?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to qualify that question a little bit. So there's kind of three different categories of audits or assessments that I think that we could do, and that is like one where we've had an engagement with customers in the past, and they're familiar with accessibility from our point of view, and have been taught some things. There's the customers that have had that have somebody who's searching out accessibility, that a developer that's going in and they're trying, and then there's the customer that just has developers that are developing an app without any accessibility concern at all. And I think I would qualify what we saw as somewhere in between those two things. It was obvious that there was some effort being done, but also that there were some misses, right? And then the other thing I'll say is the number of screens matter too, right? When you're looking at the total number of screens that was analyzed, I think that's important to consider. Seeing 100 violations in a 2-screen application would certainly be weird, right? You guys have a lot going on, and also the way that your application was structured was unique. It's like you have 10 to 14 different applications within one big application, right? And so all of those things considered, I would think that the number of violations that we found per screen was very average for a company that was trying but just needed to be guided in a different direction. I've certainly seen more violations per screen. The only time I've really seen a ton less of violations per screen was with a company that we'd already engaged with,
Sure.
and where we were doing a secondary or third stage type of audit.
Right. I think we were certainly working on our maturity at that time, and when we brought in DQ, it opened a lot of eyes, and I think it even just that in itself helped our case as we move forward. So let's do that. Let's move forward a little bit. So let's jump forward. So leadership within the product team obviously took notice. They all of a sudden saw a large pile of defects that they didn't know what to do with. They had features that they already had planned that they knew they wanted to continue working on, and there wasn't capacity that could be found within the teams themselves to take care of those things. So what happened is leadership decided to fund and assemble essentially an offshore team to kind of dedicate themselves to these defects. We essentially, put together a team of iOS developers and testers, but they weren't necessarily accessibility subject matter experts. I'll give you a little sneak peek into the future. We created some during the process, but when we started, they certainly weren't subject matter experts. This offshore team immediately started chipping away at these defects. There was quite a few actually that they were able to jump on right away with little assistance and just kind of started, taking swings at things. But after a while, as things kind of played out, they didn't have everything they needed to really kind of get at some of the more difficult problems. One of the things that my graphic is kind of showing here is that we have this dotted line from the dev consultants to the mobile product teams. They really didn't have a direct line to interact with the product teams. I mean, one, they were offshore where most of the product teams were onshore. And two, the product teams were underwater working on things. They didn't really have a lot of time to dedicate to assist these dev consultants, as I say. So they really worked closely with UX accessibility to make sure that we kind of worked as a single unit and then brought everything back to the product team. Us being co-located with many of the product teams, we were able to get in front of people and actually interact with them to make things happen. Julian, at this time, the teams were really juggling a lot. I mean, all of the mobile app teams, including ourselves and the consultants, we were all juggling a ton of stuff. There's all this hype about the new app being released. getting new features out, fixing bugs, not just accessibility. And you were still supporting 6 product teams at that time. Now you had to add this 7th team that almost needed more attention than the others. What was your experience? Like, what was going through your mind at this time?
It was pretty hectic. Already supporting the 6 teams that were US based, doing my best to advise them as they were cranking on these new features. There were all of these really ambitious plans to do new things for the users, which was great, but it almost felt like we were creating more defects at the same time as the offshore team was busily crushing all those defects. It wound up getting pretty frustrating, actually, because there was a lot of goodwill and good intent with our US based teams, but just not really like the skill set or the resources. And so I was in these kind of 2 worlds where, on the one hand, during morning check-ins with the offshore team, they're just killing it. And they've got training and resources, and they're developing all of this like confidence and expertise. And then onshore, it was kind of it felt a little bit like an uphill battle, trying to give advice that was maybe a little bit out of my depth, even because I'm not a developer.
Right.
And, it felt like the start of something good, but we really definitely needed some help.
Yeah, definitely. What was one thing you learned, you quickly learned after, we got this offshore team here, we started, working things with them? Can you give me one example?
So a lot of the defects that we had were about voiceover on iOS. And let me tell you about the Jira strings of comments where we went back and forth trying to figure out what we were talking about, and if what I was talking about as an American sitting here in Minneapolis was the same thing that our offshore accessibility team were talking about in their offices in India.
Right.
We really found that there needed to be kind of we needed to develop some norms for communication. Just because, discussing a voiceover defect isn't just discussing, what the screen reader is saying, or just what the screen reader is focusing on, or how it responds to gestures, right? It's this multidimensional thing. And it felt for a while like we were just hollering at each other over
Right.
brick walls until we were able to come up with a system.
I certainly remember realizing that there's going to be not just, the partnership in working the tickets, there's also going to be this education that has to happen, and like trying to squeeze both of those things into, 30-minute stand-ups, and that being the only, face-to-face time. Difficult. So this offshore team allowed us to put a dent in these tickets, this pile of defects we had. But, we obviously were running into bottlenecks. And the bottlenecks wasn't just the communication, but also just, from our UX A11Y backgrounds and everything, the technical aspect of things was getting a bit over our head as well. So the team, the offshore team that was hungry for, to understand and know what to do and want to do it, but we couldn't provide them what they really needed. So what we did is we brought Deque on premise to basically act as what I like to call super consultants. They kind of were tasked with jumping in. We explained everything that was kind of going on, what resources we had between UX A11Y, Dev A11Y, the product teams, and said, can you come in and help us out? And they said yes, and sent Chris. What we kind of details around this engagement, we had Deque essentially for 5 weeks of on-site support. which consisted of basically one developer consultant and one kind of testing QA consultant. And their goals, the goals we gave DQ were things like this: prioritize remaining defects and define, the tickets that should be worked. Research and propose and implement global solutions for problems, because we knew that even though we found a defect over here, it probably existed in other places that were consuming the same code. Also look for additional opportunities not already documented in defects. We had really good defects written because we got them from DQ that provided all, the details that we needed. But if there was anything additional now that we could look under the hood, we wanted to have that documented as well. We needed detailed technical instructions on certain solutions. That was a big one for the DQ team. And then also, while they were here, we wanted them to help us set up and implement some DQ tools that we were working on getting put in place as well. So with all that said, Chris, what were your initial thoughts when you came in? And let's break this down. When you interacted with, the accessibility team here in Minneapolis, the product teams here in Minneapolis, and then finally the offshore team that we were working with every day.
Yeah, so I believe the order that I met those groups, it was accessibility team, product team, and then a couple weeks later, I got introduced to your offshore team. And then I'm going to add a category, which is the collective group too. I think that's important. And I'll say that there's one point, and I'll kind of bookend it. One with the collective group, everyone that I talked to was passionate and working hard. Literally everyone across the board was like wanting to get this right. And that surprised me. Like when I saw, cause like, it's the standard scenario that I enter was not as healthy and not as motivated as what I was entering. And so I was caught a little off guard. When I first interacted with the accessibility team, and that's where, now let's get into the specifics, right? When I first entered and talked with the accessibility team, the thing that was passion, people who care about people with disabilities. But the thing that caught me off guard in this case, was isolation from the product team.
Right.
A confusion and frustration with them where maybe they weren't communicating clearly, or maybe there was miscommunications and there was frustration. I'll go back to Julian's Jira story, where I remember many stories my first couple of days there of people like, they're just closing these tickets. Why are they just closing these tickets? This isn't done. We'd go in and check, and sure enough, it wouldn't be fixed, right? And so just a combination of isolation and frustration. With the product teams, my first interaction with the product teams, I got much more openness than I was expecting, given the frustrations from the accessibility team and back and forth. And that was a lot of where I spent my initial efforts with you guys, was figuring out how these different groups of well-intentioned, passionate, working hard people could be ultimately miscommunicating and frustrating each other so much. And then the offshore team. The offshore team, I would say that the capacity in which I met them I was always the expert to them, because I had met them a little bit into the process. And so with them, it was always just, we were there, we were sitting down, we were working. And they were always very professional. But like I said, so my bookend promise here, looping it all back, collectively passionate, working hard, but also there were just key miscommunications, and I think it's because you were all, if I were to qualify those miscommunications, it would be you were all speaking just a slightly different language, whether that language be the technical versus the accessibility language, or whether that language be a literal minor communication gap and a distance gap. There was just all of these different forms of miscommunication that really I've come to view as kind of like an elephant in the room type of situation that was going on, where you had just a bunch of awesome, passionate people individually who were just having trouble getting on the same page.
I think gap is the key word there. Like we discovered many gaps, and what would often happen is our team, the UX accessibility team, would try and fill that gap while we figured out who actually should be, filling that gap. And I think you put it pretty well. Julian, tell us quickly what your first thoughts are when we had Chris just kind of kick down the door and come into our house.
It was a little disorienting at first, but also a relief, I guess, because, especially when it comes to some of the nuances of mobile accessibility, there's not a whole lot out there documented. So it was really fantastic to have somebody I could ask questions to instead of just like furiously Googling and not coming up with anything more useful than like API docs that I couldn't get anyone to read.
Right. Chris, do you have like a single interaction with the team that kind of stands out in your mind?
Yeah, there's two actually. I'm gonna take a liberty and do two. And I think I'm going to separate this between accessibility team and product team. Like I said, from the offshore team's perspective, that I met them later in the game, and so I was always kind of the expert to them, and that makes that it was just work as usual with them. But anytime I come into a new environment like that and meet a new team, there's always all right, this guy's coming in and he's an expert, but is he? And how do I know? And establishing that relationship and having that personal relationship is important. And those initial wins and those initial things where that initial trust is gained always stand out in my mind. And I feel that most closely with the accessibility side, though it does matter with the product team a little bit. The story I'll say, for the accessibility team, I remember and I get emotional thinking about it. Man, Julian, I love you. But I remember like the second or third day I was there, I was trying to figure out, all right, I got to get on the same page with Julian. She's the mobile expert here. How do I do this? And I handed her, those of you who don't know, I was key in the invention of switch control for mobile operating systems. And I handed Julian a switch control device. And come to find out that one of the reasons she's in accessibility was because she had a family member that would utilize that technology. And it was just such a personal moment of creating that connection with her where we trusted each other, and it was amazing. And from there on out, Julian and I were just like on the same page. We were hacking together in research sessions. We were figuring out how to communicate with development teams, and I was just like, it was like an instant friend. When I'm talking about product team, I remember sitting down with Rashika, I believe was her name. And Rashika was one of the iOS developers who had some of the defects that we had found. And so I was like, all right, this accessibility team is having major problems communicating with their developers. I need to get them a win for the accessibility team so that their developers will regain that trust. As I felt like responsible for regaining that the product development team's trust in the accessibility side of the organization to kind of singe that communication gap and bring them together. And I was sitting and we sat with Rashika for about 5 minutes, and 5 minutes into this thing, I helped Rashika pinpoint essentially one line of code that would knock away some third or half or quarter of the defects, and that one line of code and it established me, but also indirectly the US Bank accessibility team as the experts in this, and people that not only that were people there to help people with disabilities, but also people there that were there to make it easy and to be that source of expertise and to make it so that it's not 300 defects that are going to take us forever to fix. But if you go in and you dig in and you do these things correctly, this is a simple thing, and these are just bugs in code. And when she saw that bug, and we fixed that bug, one line of code, some odd number of defects fixed, that was just an awesome experience, and really led to a following series of successes with the offshore team.
I think if I remember correctly, that interaction with our developer took about 20 minutes. We ended up finding out that one line of code that you guys changed fixed approximately 20 tickets. And then we discovered later on, just slightly later on, that it actually existed in 40 other locations within the code base that we hadn't even known about. So that was, I remember that was just such a huge win that, 20 minutes of face-to-face time, all of a sudden we knocked out a whole big chunk of things and walked away with it really well. So Julian, one more question for you. So what I want to know is, we've been talking about development. That's the main reason why we brought Deque and Chris in to help our developers. But from a UX design perspective, what's one of the biggest takeaways that from your side of things?
So I think what really stuck with me is that on our team, we're all really sold on the value of accessibility, right? And planning for accessibility early in the process, shifting left. But what really stuck out to me was that we wound up having a lot of these kind of unplanned accessibility wins. What really jumps out to me, getting back to the switch that Chris gave me at the beginning of our work together, a few days after he gave me that switch, I ran through our app as it existed in that time, and it was really difficult. It was almost impossible to get anything done with switch control. So fast forward 5 weeks, and we've been hammering on all of these defects. They were almost all specifically calling out issues with voiceover. And the last day in the office, right before we were heading out to grab a meal together, I think, Chris and I sat down with the Bluetooth switch, and we were like, all right, let's see how this goes now. 5 weeks ago, it was unusable. And inside of about 3 minutes, I think we completed 4 or 5 of the major tasks that someone would want to do within a banking app. So even though we've been really focused on nailing the voiceover experience, because of the integration of the accessibility APIs, we were also able to take our app from unusable for switch control users to something that was not just usable, but actually a pretty good experience.
Right.
That one still makes my heart get all mushy when I think about it.
Right. I remember also, once we stepped back from all of the specifics that we were dealing with in these defects, and then reevaluating and looked at the app, just realizing what really we did was really incredible. So let's recap a little bit. So 5 weeks, we had Deque on site. We had the offshore team for a little bit earlier than that and lasted a little bit longer than that. But essentially during that time frame, we were able to take the hundreds of defects that came out of the original acceptance test, and we whittled it down to, we didn't get every single one. There was a lot of reasons for that, but we whittled it down to, a couple of dozen that were tied to global things that we really needed many teams' involvement to come together and work on, and we documented those and put them into the backlog so that they could be scheduled and worked by the team themselves. But we really we slashed the defects just incredibly. So let's kind of come back around to this our strategy. And so the story up to this point has essentially been kind of the first 6 months of 2019. The last 6 months of 2019 has really been taking all the lessons learned from our interactions with the offshore development team, with Deque, just kind of lessons learned and the issues that we ran into, and really started applying them and trying to shore up our processes, not just from our own UX accessibility side, but making sure that we were being good partners with our developers, and making sure that they had what they needed. Also, the product teams understanding things. So what we kind of look at today, and this is similar to the first slide that I showed, but I've kind of put in some specifics around what we're doing. So now we have, you know, the mobile product team that still plans, designs, and builds and tests for everything that they do. But now they definitely know that all of those steps involve some sort of accessibility, you know, thought at minimum. We still have our UX A11Y consultation. It's still 2 people at this point supporting about 6 teams. We're still mainly focused on the UX contributors and making sure that they have what they need. But obviously, after all of this, we have a lot more expertise on the technical side than we did before, so we can assist on that. The offshore team obviously isn't terribly sustainable for us, so what we're trying to do is create an internal development consultation group. It's a group right now that we partner with every single day and work with. They directly interact with the product team, developers, and testers. And we're growing this team because right now it's pretty small. We're growing it. We actually have a position open if there's any native mobile developers out there interested. We are you know, DQ coming in on premise as our super consultants is, if we could afford to do that all the time, maybe we would. But in the meantime, what we've decided to do is kind of replace that single source of truth that we were leveraging DQ as being on-site consultants, and replace that with just the DQ tools themselves. We watched them use Assure, we watched them use Attest, and put those pieces together and show how to get our developers to actually be able to do much of what they were doing on their own. And so the central, you know, point of our practice right now is that we have DQ, you know, tools like Attest, Assure, and DQ University that everybody consumes and has access to. We don't limit it to anybody, especially the university from a knowledge standpoint. And then we still have kind of our third-party back pocket consulting services, whatever. We'll often carve out a bit of the budget to make sure that we can have some of those as needed. So after all that, we're still learning. We still have a ways to go, but with, you know, a support and, you know, support like this and this a comprehensive structure around that support. You know, if we have that in place, we now know that we can quickly resolve things as they come up, and we're seeing the numbers of defects that we're putting, you know, that are reaching to our UAT environments and so on and so forth go way down. And so that is kind of the moral of the story, and the part where I want to make sure that we have time to answer some questions. So thanks everyone for listening, and I'll hand it over to Ryan to go through questions.
Thanks very much, all of you, especially our friends from US Bank, Derrin and Julian. The transparency that you're offering us, both professionally and personally, is fantastic. I think everyone on this call has a lot to learn, and you sharing this and being so transparent is very helpful. So I thank you very much. So yeah, we do have about 10 minutes for questions. We've got a bunch already, but just as a reminder, you're welcome to submit those now using the Q&A function or pasting them in the Zoom chat, and I'll work through the list and do my best to address them to our speakers here. So the first question I've got here, I think maybe Derrin and Julian, you'll be able to answer best. Sure. What do you think the reason for the communication breakdown was Do you think it will always take an outside voice to help overcome that?
I don't think it will always take that. It sure helps. You know, it's kind of like you have two sides talking about the same thing, but they're just not hearing each other. And you kind of sometimes need a third party to step in and kind of just translate. For us, and I'll let Julian chime in too, because I'm sure she's got some insight, but for us, it seems like, you know, when we're, running a mile a minute, trying to focus on all of these features, and accessibility is seen at that point, like I said, as part of the UX process, and wasn't something that the developers were, worried about. We just didn't have that kind of connection with them at that time. It just wasn't something that they were used to, and so it wasn't, like their muscle memory to reach out to us or ask us or even raise their hand if they had a concern.
And I think too, one of the things that Chris kind of forced us to do was to sit down or slow down and really notice that there were communication breakdowns happening. I think that was something that, as he mentioned, like we'd all kind of noticed, but didn't actually just stop to kind of acknowledge and try to problem solve through. Yeah. I think slowing down and starting to be more intentional about communication was a critical step for us too.
Definitely.
Great, thank you. This is a question I think that I see pretty commonly. What were the reasons for your leadership being so supportive of building an accessible product and funding it with significant resources? I.e., why didn't US Bank behave like many other companies and put 200 defects on a backlog to fix post-launch?
Even, well, I mean, we've been down that road before. So it was, the start of this kind of where we started with this kind of the story of like the launching of the mobile app and whatnot. That was, a year into a real transformation that we were doing, at least within, our UX department, and that was starting to happen throughout our kind of development practices. So the commitment was there. It was just like convincing them that the funding was worthwhile to go after it, and that's essentially what we really needed to do.
Great. Okay. Another question here. Would you say it's generally more effective to have a separate accessibility team within an organization as opposed to embedded teams?
You want to answer that, Julian? I know what I'll say too.
I guess I'm reluctant to say that yes, it is definitely better to do it the way that we do it, but I think one huge strength that our accessibility team has is that because we're sort of distributed and work with multiple teams, we often pick up on patterns and trends that teams that might otherwise be fairly siloed can miss. That was one of the big strengths that we brought to the huge defect remediation effort, was being able to view defects as a global thing, not just an individual instance on this screen owned by team A and those screens owned by team B, yada, yada, yada.
100% yes. Like the way we function works well, but we came across it because we didn't have enough consultants to put one on every single team. If we could have one consultant that we embed on every single team, that would definitely be better, at least in the beginning, because we could put more dedication and focus on individual teams. But over time, I don't think that would be necessary any longer. The consulting model allows us, exactly what Julian said, to have have the ability to see patterns across products. But it also, the biggest piece that it really allows us to do is it gives us a place to come back to, centralize around from an accessibility consulting practice standpoint, and really, make good decisions together. Because as we all know, that you know, to do accessibility right, we need to bring all perspectives, all experiences to our, you know, our decision making. And when you have a group of people, you can do that a lot easier.
Yeah, and I think a final thing I'll add to that is the native mobile aspect of this adds a layer of complexity that there isn't enough native mobile expertise or documentation to go around right now. And so, and also the evolution of the platforms is so fast. I mean, iOS and Android release new features on a semi-annual basis, and expecting developers essentially at that point to keep up with all that is crazy.
So, Chris, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was actually a question. Would you recommend any, do you know of any references that we could provide that highlight the differences between like iOS and accessibility platforms and their accessibility? Where would you tell people to go?
Funny that you ask that.
Just pay you to come over, that's the answer?
You gotta get me on a call. No, seriously, I am working on a blog post right now that emphasizes the need for native mobile accessibility expertise specifically, and I hope to have that out by the end of the week. And if you read that and it perks your interest, then we should have a conversation.
Great. Let's see here. I'm seeing a common thread of questions about your decisions to work with an offshore team. Is that something you would continue to recommend?
I wouldn't, you know, go one way or another. Like you work with what you have available often. I mean, if you have the choice, you got to weigh out the pros and cons as you see them for the need that you have. For us, we already had offshore teams, you know, stood up. Standing up another one was relatively, you know, quick and efficient. So that's what one decision that was made.
One thing I'd want to tack on to that is, I mean, I guess the decision to have an offshore team was made well above me, but something that turned out to be really valuable was that the people who made up that original core team, once it was disbanded, got distributed out to other teams that were also working on the US Bank apps. So what that means is that this one particular dev, Shailendra, who was so quick and just really got it right away during our main working time together, I still work with him now, but he's embedded within another Journey team. And so he exists as a resource for those people. And also, you know, I can reach out to him if I need to pitch a defect his direction. Just having that kind of continuity has been incredibly valuable.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for one more here. This one's getting a little specific. Can you talk about what checks are added to the code to help prevent regressions, unit tests, or end-to-end tests?
Yeah. Go ahead, Derrin.
My answer will be short for this one right now, and I'll let you go further, Chris. So from a unit test perspective, again, one of the things that we learned after the fact was that where we were doing our UI testing was too far down the line for us to bring in something like Attest or any other tool to do the accessibility testing in a way that would allow us to catch things earlier. So essentially what we are doing is we're having to manually trigger those automated tests as the developers go, similarly to how a web developer might run the Axe plugin against their page as they're developing it. It's a bit more cumbersome, but it's the way we're working right now. We're in the process of getting it put into our pipeline so that it can be done more automatically.
Yeah, there are a few tools out there that do that. I mean, Deque has tools, Attest, et cetera, that do that type of testing. The thing I'll say that I think fits well in the context of this presentation is that it's important to make sure that your accessibility consultants and expertise and internal or whatever that be is in line with what that tool is reporting. I think in web, this is not as much of a concern. When you look at web accessibility, it's fairly standardized, and the rules come from standards that have been heavily debated and talked about, whereas the mobile tools that do this, they don't have that level of scrutiny. They don't have that level of standardization behind them. So, you know, you're talking about whether it's Apple's accessibility inspector or Google's accessibility analyzer tool or their Espresso library. The important thing to realize is slapping on some automated checks and calling yourself good is a dangerous thing, especially when those things are not necessarily scrutinized to the level that the web stuff is. And so, yes, there are tools out there, but make sure that if you're utilizing those tools, that they come and that the checks that you're enabling are things that are good, solid standards backed by things that are agreement and not just best practices, or even worse, I've seen some rules in some libraries out there that encourage bad things. Mm-hmm. Be cautious and make sure that those come from a point of expertise, and that any internal expertise or consultancy that you're giving regarding how the app should behave from a manual testing perspective is absolutely in line with those things, because I think that is one of those things that can cause that miscommunication, that frustration symptom, is when a Google library, for example, is providing expertise that goes against what an accessibility expert is saying. And you're gonna sow mistrust in an organization if you're not all absolutely on the same page with what your tool is saying versus what your manual consultants are saying.
Fantastic. All right, I think we still have quite a few questions that we weren't unfortunately able to answer, but we're going to do our best to reach out to those of you who did submit them and get you some answers. Sure. And as I promised earlier, if we're able to share the recording, we absolutely will do that next week. Special thank you very much for Julian, Derrin, and Chris's time. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, have a great one.
Thanks
everyone.
much.
Thanks.